So today we'll be looking at Colossians chapter 3, verse 19, which reads, "Husbands, love the wives and do not be bitter against them." So what does this mean? This means that husbands ought to do what? They ought to show affection toward their wives. So in order to know what love is and the characteristics of love, we have to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which tells us this. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. So we're going to look at this one by one, and we have to look at first patience. What does it mean to be patient as a husband? Be calm with your wife, right? Don't sit there and push her. Don't be impatient with her. Don't sit there and be like, well, you ought to do this. You should do this. You should do that, right? Don't pressure her. You don't pressure somebody. By being patient with them, you allow them to be able to do what? To collect themselves, to think clearly, and to be able to operate with peace. Second, it tells us what love is kind. So we must be, as husbands, we ought to be kind toward our wives, loving, right? Gentle, with care, not rough around the edges. As it also tells you, do not, roughhouse your wives, right? Do not be rough with your wives. Be gentle with your wives. It's what you ought to do as husbands. Third thing it tells us is what? Do not envy or boast. When it comes to you being a husband, as most men like to be the heroes in this country, based on American traditionalism, they like to be the heroes of their wife's story, right? My wife can't do this, well, I can come in and I can do this for her. And I could just be like, well, look at me, look at me doing this. And that way she takes, pleasure in that. She's in awe of my ability to do X, Y, or Z. You're not the hero. God is the hero. You are to support your wife. You're supposed to aid her. You're supposed to help her, not try to be your hero. And so, as a husband who's supposed to love your wife, you're not supposed to sit there and find yourself in a predicament in which you're bragging about all that you do for her. And you are also, as it also tells you, envy, right? You don't be jealous of her achievements or her accomplishments. You applaud her and you support her through her achievements. You don't sit there and look to compete with her. It's not a competition. This is your wife, right? It also tells us it's not arrogant or rude. You as a husband, you ought not to be rude to your wife. Be kind to her. Be gentle to her. Love her, right? And part of love is to not be rude to her. You're not to be aggressive in nature, verbally or physically, right, with her. There is no need to do this. This is your wife, even with a person, right? Even with a common person. But in the case of this, the context here is your wife. You ought not to be rude to your wife. You must be respectful toward her. It also tells us what does not insist on its own way, which is pride. You as a husband, you ought not to be prideful. If your wife has sound advisement, listen to it and take that into account, right? Don't sit there and neglect it because, it's your wife and, I'm the husband and I lead the way. No. If she sees something you don't, you better take it into consideration. If she has wise advisement that is going to be beneficial for the both of you, you ought to listen to it. Do not reject it, do not neglect it, but actually take it in and incorporate it as part of your solution. It also tells us that what? It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Don't, as a husband, find yourself in a predicament in which you're joyous over your wife's failure so you can come in and save the day. No. If she fails at something, you want to bring her up with positive words, positive messaging. What you don't want to do is sit there and just be like, yes, she failed. And that way I can come in and be, Superman for her and be her hero. God is her hero. God will come in and save the day. You ought not to do that. You ought to do what? Lift her up with positive words and messages. It rejoices at the truth. That's what love does, right? And so with that being said, you must, as a husband, be joyous in the fact that she is living true by God. Don't be joyous in the fact that she fails. Be joyous in what she does for God, by God. Love bears all things, which means it holds all things, right? Love holds the marriage together. It believes all things. You, because you have love within you as a husband, you believe in your wife. You believe in the good that she has by God. Hopes all things. You, along with your wife, you hope for a better future, a better this, a better that, whatever the case may be, right? But you, alongside your wife, you both hope for good, and you hope that all evil eradicates off the face of the earth. And as it pertains to your marriage, you hope that your marriage is long-lasting, it's fruitful, bears the fruits of righteousness that it needs to. And it endures all things. You and your wife, as a husband, you must endure the trials and tribulations of life. That way you're able to persevere through the love of God. And lastly, love never ends. Love for your wife, it never ends, never ceases. You must love her till the day you die. That is what it means in Colossians 13 to love your wife. All these things I just listed down for you is what you as a husband ought to do. So, see, it looks like a very simple verse. It's just like, husbands, love your wife. Well, what does that mean? You have to think critically when you're reading the Bible. You can't just read it and say, okay, it says husbands love your wives. That's it. Don't be bitter toward them. And then move on to the next verse. What does that mean? You have to ask yourself. You have to pose questions. What does love mean? And I just broke down to you in Colossians 1 or Colossians 13, or 1 Corinthians 13, I should say, that is what love is. And so as a husband, you ought to be that for your wife and reflect the love of God through and through your marriage.